In 2016, the brand that had once become a verb in the American living room was quietly sold for $1.1 billion to Rovi, an obscure patent licensing company. TiVo, the glowing hardware that taught America how to pause live television, had been reduced to a mere portfolio of intellectual property. A decade earlier, its iconic peanut-shaped remote sat on millions of coffee tables, promising absolute control over the broadcast schedule. It was a cultural phenomenon. But the paradox is that TiVo did not disappear, because America stopped wanting on-demand television. It disappeared because America wanted it in a different form. The hardware still worked. The market around it had simply changed. But the real story of TiVo is not just the story of a corporate buyout. It is the story of how a Silicon Valley startup invented the modern digital video recorder, rewired American habits, and then lost the physical living room to the very distribution pipes and streaming clouds that followed. Every week, we tell the stories of American devices, platforms, software, stores, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in a San Jose engineering lab in 1999. Before the year 1999, the American television schedule was a rigid physical constraint. A family's evening revolved entirely around the broadcast clock. If a highly anticipated sitcom aired at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, the viewer had to be sitting on the living room sofa exactly at 8 o'clock, or the moment was gone forever. The only defense against this schedule was the video cassette recorder, or VCR. But programming a VCR required a frustrating, highly manual ritual. A user had to insert a blank magnetic tape, navigate a clunky on-screen interface to set a timer, and pray that the television network did not shift the broadcast by 3 minutes, which would cut off the ending. The VCR was an analog machine built for an analog era. The flashing 12 ohms on the front display of millions of units became a widespread cultural joke, a symbol of consumer technology that was simply too tedious to use properly. Television was a one-way street. The networks dictated the time, and the American living room obeyed. In 1997, two veteran engineers named Mike Ramsey and Jim Barton were working in San Jose, California, deep in the heart of Silicon Valley. Both had previously worked at Silicon Graphics, a company famous for high-end computing workstations. They initially formed a startup called Teleworld, setting out to build a home network system that would distribute digital files around a house. But their focus quickly shifted to a much more immediate and universal problem: the television set. They realized that the rapidly falling price of digital storage meant they could fundamentally change how video was processed in the home. They envisioned a completely new kind of device. They wanted to build a digital video recorder, or DVR, a machine that captures television broadcasts onto an internal disc rather than physical magnetic tape. Giving the viewer the power to manipulate the feed in real time. But building a DVR in the late 1990s was a massive technical hurdle. Ramsey and Barton were essentially trying to put a personal computer, a machine designed for one person to use directly, usually at a desk, into the quiet, shared sanctity of the family living room. Computers of that era were loud, ugly, and intrusive. They featured whirring cooling fans, clicking storage disks, and beige plastic cases. A hard drive, a storage device that keeps files, software, and operating systems permanently even after the power is off, generates significant heat and acoustic noise when it is constantly spinning. The engineers had to design a box that could quietly read and write massive video files simultaneously, day and night, without sounding like a piece of office equipment ruining a quiet movie scene. Furthermore, the machine had to process raw television signals on the fly. It required specialized chips capable of handling MPEG-2 digital compression, converting an incoming analog cable feed into digital data, storing it on the hard drive, and playing it back to the television screen with only a fraction of a second of delay. This was the kind of intense, simultaneous read and write operation usually reserved for a corporate server, a powerful computer that provides data and services to other machines. TiVo was trying to put that level of processing power on an ordinary TV stand, disguised as a sleek black piece of audio-visual equipment. When the company, now officially renamed TiVo, finally unveiled its first consumer hardware at the Consumer Electronics Show in January 1999, it partnered with Philips Electronics to manufacture the physical boxes. The original Philips HDR-110 model promised 14 hours of recording time, but the retail reality waiting for them was brutal. The company had to convince average American consumers to walk into a mall electronics store, walk down the aisle, and pay $499 for a box they fundamentally did not understand. Furthermore, the hardware cost was only the beginning. TiVo also demanded an ongoing subscription, a business model where users pay repeatedly for continued access, costing $9.95 a month just to use the electronic program guide. At the time, asking a consumer to pay a monthly fee just for the privilege of recording television felt absurd to many buyers. Retail workers at chains like Circuit City and Best Buy struggled to pitch the device. If a customer asked what a TiVo did, the salesperson's answer usually sounded exactly like a VCR, just wildly more expensive. To make matters more complicated for the consumer, the early TiVo boxes required a physical connection to a home telephone line. The device contained a built-in modem, hardware that lets computers send data over standard phone lines. Every night, usually in the early hours of the morning, the TiVo box would silently dial a toll-free number, tie up the family phone line for a few minutes, and download the updated television schedule for the next 2 weeks. It was a completely foreign ritual for a television accessory. The television networks themselves viewed this new technology with deep suspicion. For decades, the entire American broadcasting industry had been built on the concept of linear television, a system where programs and advertisements are delivered on a fixed schedule that the viewer cannot alter. The business model of every major network relied on millions of Americans sitting through commercial breaks simply because it was too much effort to get up and leave the room. The idea that a machine could easily skip past these highly lucrative advertisements terrified television executives. While TiVo secured early investments from some forward-thinking media companies, many in the industry viewed the hard drive in the living room not as an innovation, but as a direct threat to their core revenue. When consumers looked at the box on the Circuit City shelf, they saw a black metal chassis featuring a distinct, smiling television mascot stamped on the front. It didn't look threatening. It looked friendly. Yet the price tag remained a massive barrier. $499 in 1999 was a significant investment for a single-purpose entertainment device, especially one that required an additional monthly fee. Some early adopters opted for a lifetime subscription for an additional $199, betting that the startup would survive long enough to make the upfront cost worthwhile. But for the average family, it was a staggering ask. Initial sales were painfully slow. The American market did not yet have the vocabulary for time shifting. A salesperson could talk about hard drives, digital compression, and modems all day, but to a family browsing a retail shelf, it was an impossible sell. The true power of the machine was completely invisible until it was actively experienced. The hardware was finally ready, sitting in heavy cardboard boxes in electronics aisles across the country. But to survive, the company had to figure out how to make a complex, loud, internet-connected computer feel like an effortless piece of absolute magic. Selling a hard drive in a metal box was never going to be enough to change American habits. A machine that merely recorded video was just an expensive VCR. To cross the threshold from an obscure piece of computing hardware into a beloved living room companion, TiVo had to make complex digital processing feel completely invisible. The breakthrough did not happen inside the black metal chassis. It happened in the palm of the user's hand. The traditional American television remote was a notoriously terrible piece of industrial design. By the late 1990s, most remotes were long, rectangular slabs of cheap black plastic covered in 60 identical grid-aligned buttons. They were designed for engineers, not families. In the dark, a viewer had to fumble to find the right volume key, often accidentally changing the channel instead. TiVo's design team threw the traditional template away. They created the iconic Peanut remote, a device with a pinched waist that rested perfectly balanced in the hand, regardless of whether the user was right-handed or left-handed. Instead of a sea of identical gray squares, the TiVo remote used distinct shapes, vibrant colors, and tactile spacing. The thumb naturally fell directly onto the most critical controls: the bright yellow pause button, the rewind button, and the fast-forward button. This physical object was the key to unlocking the user interface, the on-screen menus, graphics, and audio cues that allow a human being to communicate with a machine. TiVo's interface was entirely distinct from the cold, clinical menus of a standard cable box. When a user pressed a button, the system responded with highly specific engineered sound effects. A satisfying, hollow bloop confirmed a selection. A cheerful, rising chime played when a program was successfully scheduled to record. A gentle, descending bong warned the user when they reached the end of a menu. In American living rooms, dormitories, and basements, these sounds quickly became an auditory Pavlovian bell. A single bloop, echoing from a television set, instantly signaled that a family had entered the digital age. The most magical trick this interface performed was the ability to pause live television. To the average consumer, this felt impossible. But the technical reality was brilliantly simple. The TiVo box was constantly recording whatever channel the television was tuned to, creating a rolling 30-minute buffer on the hard drive. In a typical American household, this feature fundamentally altered the evening dynamic. If the home telephone rang in the middle of a crucial football play, or a child started crying during the climax of a movie, the viewer simply pressed the yellow button on the Peanut remote. The live broadcast froze on the screen. The user could leave the room for 20 minutes, return to the sofa, press play, and resume watching exactly where they left off, while the box silently continued recording the rest of the live broadcast in the background. It was a profound transfer of power. For the first time in broadcasting history, the television was waiting for the viewer. But surviving this era required more than clever engineering. It required legal and strategic genius. At the exact same 1999 Consumer Electronics Show where TiVo debuted, a rival company called Replay TV also introduced a digital video recorder. In many ways, Replay TV was aimed at power users, offering advanced networking features. Most notably, Replay TV included a feature called Auto Skip, which automatically detected and bypassed commercial breaks without the user needing to press a single button. It was a viewer's ultimate dream, but it was a corporate death sentence. The major American television networks and Hollywood studios viewed automated commercial skipping as an existential threat to their billion-dollar advertising model. They unleashed a relentless wave of copyright lawsuits against Replay TV. The litigation drained the rival company's resources, frightened away retail partners, and eventually forced Replay TV into bankruptcy. TiVo's executives watched this legal slaughter and made a highly calculated compromise. They deliberately chose not to automate commercial skipping. Instead, they offered a fast-forward button that could scan through recorded video at up to 60 times normal speed. The user still had to physically hold the remote, watch the screen as the commercial break flew past, and manually press play when the television show returned. Because the viewer was still technically interacting with the broadcast, TiVo managed to stay just on the right side of copyright law. By forcing the user to do a tiny bit of manual labor, TiVo avoided the lawsuits that destroyed their biggest early competitor. With the legal threat temporarily managed, TiVo introduced another feature that felt distinctly like science fiction: the algorithm. An algorithm is a set of mathematical rules and calculations a computer uses to make decisions or predictions. The Peanut remote featured two prominent, thumb-shaped buttons, one green pointing up, one red pointing down. Users were encouraged to rate the programs they watched. The TiVo software logged these preferences, analyzed the viewing habits, and then silently recorded programs it thought the family might enjoy in the middle of the night. A user might wake up, turn on the television, and discover that the machine had automatically saved a documentary or a classic film that perfectly matched their tastes. The box was no longer just a passive recorder, it was an active curator. Yet despite the perfect remote, the brilliant interface, and the legal maneuvering, TiVo still faced the brutal reality of the American retail shelf. Asking consumers to buy a $500 standalone box was a slow, painful way to grow a business. The true distribution breakthrough arrived in the year 2000, when TiVo struck a massive partnership with DirectTV, one of the largest satellite television providers in the United States. Instead of forcing customers to buy a separate TiVo box at a mall electronics store, the two companies integrated the TiVo hard drive and operating system directly into the DirectTV satellite receiver. This bypassed the retail bottleneck completely. When families signed up for a premium satellite package, the installation technician simply wired a TiVo-powered box into the living room. The user didn't have to understand digital compression, modems, or hard drives. They just picked up the Peanut remote and started pausing live television. This single partnership placed the hardware into millions of homes, cementing the brand's dominance. The foundation was completely built. The product was no longer an obscure piece of silicon struggling to explain itself in a Best Buy aisle. It was a household obsession, ready to rewrite the very definition of American prime time. By 2003, the physical black box had transcended its origins as a niche piece of Silicon Valley hardware. It had become something much rarer, an active verb in the American vocabulary. "I'll TiVo it" meant absolute freedom from the rigid broadcast clock. Thanks to the DirectTV partnership, which integrated the technology directly into satellite receivers, the company largely bypassed the friction of the mall electronics store. The hardware was quietly sliding into millions of homes, sitting on television stands, its green indicator lights glowing softly in the dark while the hard drive hummed. This was not merely a convenient piece of consumer electronics. Before TiVo, broadcast networks like NBC, CBS, and ABC completely controlled the physical reality of the American evening. If a highly anticipated television finale started at 8 o'clock, a family had to be sitting in the living room exactly at 8 o'clock. After TiVo, the physical power and the control of time shifted entirely away from the massive media conglomerates and directly to the user sitting on the sofa. The television industry was forced to recognize this massive transfer of power, and they were terrified. In New York, advertising executives on Madison Avenue realized that families were aggressively fast-forwarding through the 30-second commercials that funded the entire television ecosystem. Surveys circulated in trade publications suggesting that early TiVo users were skipping up to 70% of all broadcast advertisements. The television network was no longer a dictator, it was merely a raw data feed that the TiVo hard drive processed and stripped of its commercial value. In mall electronics stores across the country, inside Circuit City aisles and Best Buy home theater displays, the TiVo box was no longer a confusing pitch. Sales representatives did not have to explain what a digital video recorder was. Customers walked in specifically asking for it by name. The satisfying bloop of the user interface had become the soundtrack of the modern American weekend. The ultimate demonstration of this new cultural power arrived on February 1, 2004, during the halftime show of Super Bowl XXVIII, When Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake experienced their infamous fraction-of-a-second wardrobe malfunction on live television, the American viewing public did not just gasp. They picked up the peanut-shaped remote. TiVo's internal data later revealed that user activity spiked by an astonishing 900% during that exact moment. Millions of Americans pressed the yellow pause button, hit the rewind button, and played the live broadcast back in slow motion. It was widely reported as the most rewatched moment in television history up to that point. The 2004 Super Bowl proved to the entire country that live television was no longer a fleeting, untouchable stream of light. It was data, and the viewer now held it in their hands. Because TiVo was built by software engineers and not traditional Hollywood executives, the operating system was designed to learn. The TiVo suggestions algorithm, the underlying code that analyzed viewing habits, became a central feature of the American living room. The device silently watched what the user watched. If a viewer consistently recorded science fiction programs or a specific actor's films, the machine took note. While the family slept, the TiVo box would independently scan the electronic program guide, find related broadcasts airing at 3 in the morning, and silently save them to the local hard drive. Users would wake up, turn on the television, and discover a curated list of programs they had not asked for, but that perfectly matched their tastes. It felt like magic. In college dorm rooms, students woke up to marathons of classic animation. In suburban living rooms, parents found niche cooking shows they didn't know existed. The machine was not just recording television, it was programming a customized network for an audience of one. The brand was so beloved that it became a fixture of American pop culture. Hollywood writers who used the device constantly in their own homes began writing it into their scripts. Characters on hit shows like Sex and the City openly discussed their TiVo boxes. It became a cultural shorthand for the busy, successful American professional who was too important to wait for a network schedule. By 2006, TiVo reached approximately 4.4 million total subscribers, marking the absolute peak of its cultural dominance. The company had built a flawless interface, a perfect remote control, and a user base that absolutely adored the product. But this massive scale was built on a dangerous foundation. During this golden era, the hardware itself evolved into something of a cult object. The TiVo Series 2, launched in the early 2000s, became the definitive American DVR. It wasn't just a sealed appliance, it became a platform for tech enthusiasts. Across the country, a unique physical ritual emerged in college dorm rooms, apartment living rooms, and suburban garages. Users would buy a standard retail TiVo box, intentionally void the manufacturer's warranty, open the black metal chassis, and physically install larger desktop computer hard drives. An entire cottage industry of online forums and mail-order websites sprang up, selling pre-formatted drives and specialized tools to consumers who wanted 300 hours of digital recording time instead of 40. This level of physical modification proved something crucial. Americans did not just use the device. They felt a deep sense of ownership over the hardware. It was their machine, holding their personalized version of the television universe. The user base functioned less like standard consumers and more like an unpaid fanatical sales force. The concept of the TiVo evangelist became a recognized phenomenon in market research. When a family experienced the power of the user interface, specifically a software feature called the Season Pass, they inevitably forced their friends and coworkers to sit on their sofa for a demonstration. Before the Season Pass, recording a weekly television show required a user to manually select a time slot every single week using a VCR timer. If the broadcast network moved the show from Tuesday to Thursday, the recording failed. The Season Pass algorithm changed this entirely. A user simply told the system to record a specific title, and the software tracked it across schedule changes, sports delays, and reruns, guaranteeing the episode would be waiting on the hard drive. It transformed the television set from a live, stressful feed into a calm, personalized library. Word-of-mouth marketing drove adoption harder than any television commercial could. But this massive cultural gravity forced the entire American media ecosystem to react. Hollywood writers and advertising executives were not just complaining at industry conferences, they were actively changing how television was produced. Because TiVo users were skipping commercials at unprecedented rates, networks began aggressively experimenting with product placement, physically embedding branded sodas, cars, and computers directly into the scenes of reality shows and sitcoms, so the advertisements could not be fast-forwarded. The 30-second commercial break, a staple of the American economy since the 1950s, was suddenly viewed as a fragile, dying format. The glowing green indicator light on the front of the TiVo box was effectively rewriting the financial model of the American media industry. By 2006, the release of the TiVo Series 3 brought the platform into the high-definition era. It was a massive, premium piece of hardware featuring an elegant OLED display on the front panel and a luxury price tag of $790. It proved that a dedicated segment of the American public was willing to pay a heavy premium for the ultimate television experience. The company's total subscriber count surged past 4.4 million, largely fueled by the immensely successful DirectTV partnership. For a brief, shining moment, TiVo stood at the absolute center of the American digital living room. Before TiVo, media conglomerates dictated the rhythm of American life, forcing families to organize their evenings around a printed television guide. After TiVo, physical power and temporal control shifted entirely, from the corporate broadcasting tower to the user holding the peanut remote. But to maintain this power, the device required a physical connection to the television feed. TiVo did not manufacture the televisions, and crucially, it did not own the coaxial cables buried under American streets or the satellites orbiting above. The brand had won the culture, the interface had won the user, but the company was about to learn a brutal lesson about the American technology market. A brilliant product cannot survive if the companies that control the distribution pipes decide they want the living room back. The first crack in the empire did not come from a better piece of technology. It came from a partner deciding to break a promise. The American technology market is notoriously unforgiving. A product can feature the best interface, cultivate the most loyal users, and achieve absolute cultural relevance, yet still fail if it loses its access to the consumer. For TiVo, the small crack that eventually broke the empire did not happen in a living room, and it was not caused by a superior piece of engineering. It happened in a corporate boardroom when a crucial partner decided to break a promise. By 2005, the partnership with DirectTV was the undisputed engine of TiVo's growth. The satellite provider was responsible for delivering the majority of TiVo's new subscribers, allowing the Silicon Valley company to bypass the crowded electronics store shelf entirely. But the executives at DirectTV recognized a dangerous shift in power. They realized they were handing over the most valuable piece of real estate in the American home, the television interface, to a third-party startup. Whoever controlled the remote controlled the customer relationship, the viewing data, and the advertising potential. In a devastating strategic pivot, DirectTV announced it was developing its own proprietary digital video recorder in partnership with a company called NDS Group. The new DirectTV box was technologically inferior to TiVo. It lacked the beloved peanut remote, replacing it with a standard, confusing plastic wand. It did not have the satisfying bloop audio cues, and it certainly did not feature the TiVo suggestions algorithm. The interface was rigid, sluggish, and purely utilitarian. But to the average consumer, this generic box had one insurmountable advantage. It was the default. When an American family ordered a new satellite package in 2006, the installation technician no longer wired a TiVo into the living room. They plugged in the generic DirectTV DVR. If a customer specifically wanted the TiVo experience, they had to actively request it, often paying an additional premium or navigating a complex upgrade path. Almost overnight, TiVo's greatest distribution pipeline was choked off. This was the brutal reality of the second American tech market force: retail, distribution, defaults, and platform access. A device did not only have to be technologically excellent, it had to survive where people actually acquired their technology. When TiVo lost the default installation status, its subscriber growth instantly stalled. The major American cable television companies, massive regional monopolies like Comcast and Time Warner Cable, watched the DirectTV betrayal and quickly adopted the exact same strategy. They recognized that the DVR was no longer a luxury novelty. It was a baseline expectation for the modern television viewer. But the cable giants refused to pay TiVo's licensing fees, and they absolutely refused to surrender their on-screen branding to a smiling television mascot. Instead, they began aggressively deploying their own generic DVR boxes, manufactured by industrial hardware companies like Motorola and Scientific Atlanta. These cable company DVRs were objectively worse in almost every conceivable way. The Scientific Atlanta boxes, heavily deployed across the East Coast, featured a notoriously laggy interface built on a harsh blue grid. Fast-forwarding through a commercial was a jerky, imprecise nightmare compared to TiVo's smooth, frame-by-frame scrub. The remotes were cluttered with dozens of unnecessary buttons. The hard drives were small, loud, and prone to failing, erasing entire libraries of saved television shows without warning. Yet the generic cable box possessed a superpower that TiVo could not beat: bundling. Bundling is a business tactic where a company combines multiple services, like cable television, internet access, and hardware rentals, into a single monthly bill. To bring a standalone TiVo into the home, a customer had to drive to a Best Buy or Circuit City, spend $300 or more on the physical metal box, figure out how to wire it into the back of their television, and then agree to pay TiVo an additional $12.95 every single month for the programming guide. In contrast, the cable company offered their generic DVR as a free upgrade for signing a new contract. The monthly rental fee for the box was quietly buried deep within the fine print of the cable bill. It required no trip to the store and no complex setup. The cable technician simply screwed the coaxial wire into the wall, handed the family a plastic remote, and left. The American consumer was forced to make a collective decision. Given the choice between a perfect, joyful, highly engineered user interface that required a steep upfront cost and a clunky, frustrating, generic box that was already plugged into the wall, the market overwhelmingly chose convenience. The cultural habit of time-shifting television had been permanently cemented into American life. Families still paused live sports, and they still fast-forwarded through commercial breaks. But they were no longer doing it on a TiVo. The habit remained. The hardware was quietly unplugged, shoved into the back of hall closets, and replaced by the blinking lights of a Motorola cable box. By 2007, TiVo's total subscriber numbers began to slowly bleed. The company attempted to pivot, trying to license its superior software back to the very cable companies that were replacing it, hoping to become the operating system that ran on the generic hardware. But the cable monopolies had little incentive to pay a premium for a better interface when their customers were already accepting the mediocre default. TiVo was steadily losing the physical battle for the living room TV stand. But the ultimate threat was not another piece of metal manufactured by a cable company. The true danger was a fundamental shift in how the internet worked, a technological wave that was about to prove that television no longer needed to be downloaded to a local hard drive at all. For the first decade of the 2000s, the battle for the American living room was fought over physical storage. The winner was assumed to be the company that could put the biggest, quietest hard drive under the television. But the ultimate threat to TiVo was not another piece of metal manufactured by a cable monopoly. It was a fundamental shift in the architecture of the internet. In 2007, a company known mostly for mailing DVDs in red envelopes launched a new digital feature. Netflix introduced streaming, a technology that delivers audio or video over the internet continuously, without requiring the user to download or own a permanent physical copy. Shortly after, Hulu launched, offering next-day access to major broadcast network shows. This was not just a new way to watch television. It was an existential threat to the very concept of the digital video recorder. TiVo was built on the premise of interception. The machine sat between the cable wall outlet and the television, catching a live broadcast as it flew by and trapping it on a local spinning disk. But streaming relied on a cloud service, a system that stores and processes data on massive remote servers instead of on a local device in the home. If an entire season of a television show was permanently stored on a server in a data center hundreds of miles away, ready to be played at the exact second the viewer clicked a button, the viewer no longer needed to record it. The rolling 30-minute buffer, the season pass algorithm, the careful management of hard drive space, all of these beloved TiVo features suddenly felt like unnecessary chores. The physical reality of the American television stand began to change. Next to the generic, clunky cable box, consumers began plugging in cheap silent streaming devices like the Roku or the Apple TV. These new machines did not have massive, noisy internal hard drives. They were just tiny digital doorways to the internet. TiVo attempted to adapt to this new reality. They updated their software to include apps for Netflix and Amazon, hoping to become the ultimate unified search engine for the living room. But it was too late. On a streaming device, TiVo's brilliant, patented time-shifting interface was irrelevant. This was the brutal execution of the fourth American tech market force: smartphone, cloud, streaming, and convenience displacement. A technology does not need to be perfectly replaced. It only needs to be bypassed by a more convenient system. The American consumer realized that local ownership of a television broadcast was a burden. Renting access from the cloud was infinitely easier. As hardware sales plummeted and the cable monopolies tightened their grip on the generic DVR market, TiVo's corporate strategy drastically shifted. The company realized that while they were losing the retail shelf, they still held some of the most valuable foundational patents in the history of consumer electronics. They owned the legal rights to the fundamental software mechanisms that allowed a machine to pause live television and fast-forward through a recorded digital stream. TiVo retreated from the electronics aisle and entered the courtroom. Over the next decade, the company launched a relentless wave of patent infringement lawsuits against almost every major television and telecommunications company in America. They sued EchoStar, the parent company of the Dish Network. They sued AT&T. They sued Verizon. They sued Motorola and Cisco, the massive industrial hardware companies manufacturing the generic cable boxes that had stolen their default status. From a purely financial perspective, this legal pivot was incredibly successful. TiVo extracted billions of dollars in settlements and licensing fees from the giants of the American telecom industry. The corporate balance sheet remained healthy, but the cultural soul of the company had fundamentally changed. The brand that was once a beloved, magical verb in the American household had transformed into a feared intellectual property enforcer. They were no longer building the future of the living room. They were simply taxing the companies that had taken it from them. By the mid-2010s, the original promise of the TiVo box was completely obsolete. The American consumer no longer rushed home to catch a broadcast, nor did they program a hard drive to catch it for them. The entire concept of prime time had been dismantled by the cloud. Television was now an endless, on-demand stream of digital content, accessed through brightly colored app icons on smart TVs and mobile phones. In April 2016, the final corporate reality set in. TiVo was acquired for $1.1 billion by Rovi Corporation, a company almost exclusively known for buying and licensing digital entertainment patents. Rovi immediately adopted the TiVo name for the combined company, keeping the famous brand alive in the stock market. But the era of the hardware pioneer was officially over. The Silicon Valley engineers, who had once rewired the American evening, had been fully absorbed into a portfolio of legal documents. The box disappeared. The cable company won the shelf. The hard drive stopped spinning. The files moved to the cloud. The user clicked an app. The patent outlived the plastic. The habit was gone. In the years following the 2016 acquisition, the TiVo brand did not technically die. It simply ceased to be a physical pioneer and settled into a highly profitable corporate afterlife. The acquiring company, Rovi, eventually merged with another licensing giant called Xperi. Today, the TiVo logo still appears on occasional pieces of hardware and smart television operating systems. But the soul of the Silicon Valley startup that fundamentally rewired the American living room is gone. The brand survived, but it was hollowed out, transformed from a revolutionary consumer product into a corporate trademark, used to license intellectual property to the very cable and streaming giants that ultimately defeated it. Yet across the United States, a dedicated subculture of preservationists and tech enthusiasts refuses to let the original hardware fade into complete obscurity. In vintage computer forums and deep within the archives of sites like TiVo Community, users still trade advice on how to keep 20-year-old Series 2 and Series 3 boxes operational. Companies like Weenie's, a specialized retailer that built a business out of upgrading and repairing TiVo hardware, still offer massive hard drive replacements for aging machines. For these collectors, a surviving TiVo box is not just a piece of outdated electronics. It is an accidental historical archive. When a user powers on a heavily modified TiVo from 2004, the spinning hard drive does not just contain a television show. It holds a perfect, unbroken time capsule of the American broadcast ecosystem. Because the machine recorded the raw, live feed, a surviving drive contains the local news bumpers, the unedited commercial breaks, the emergency weather scrolls, and the specific cultural rhythm of an evening that no longer exists. Digital archivists now scour thrift stores, estate sales, and eBay listings looking for these old, heavy black boxes, hoping to extract standard-definition broadcasts that the major television networks themselves failed to preserve. But the true legacy of TiVo goes far beyond the physical preservation of its hardware. This is not just a story of consumer nostalgia for a smiling television mascot or a cleverly shaped plastic controller. The original TiVo box remains one of the most important transition devices in the history of American technology because it fundamentally reprogrammed the psychological expectations of the user. Before the year 1999, the American consumer accepted that they were subordinate to the television network. If an entertainment company scheduled a broadcast, the family adjusted their life to match it. TiVo was the machine that shattered that contract. It proved that television was just data, and that data could be paused, manipulated, and stored. Every single digital entertainment interface that an American uses today is built on the psychological foundation that TiVo laid. When a user opens the Netflix app and sees a row of highly personalized algorithmic recommendations based on their past viewing habits, they are experiencing the direct descendant of the TiVo suggestions feature. When a viewer pauses a live sports stream on Hulu to answer a phone call, or scrubs through a YouTube timeline to find a specific moment, they are exercising the exact temporal power that Jim Barton and Mike Ramsey first coded into a beige development box in a San Jose lab. The tragedy of TiVo is that they won the cultural war, but lost the physical living room. They successfully convinced the entire country that on-demand television was the only acceptable way to consume media, but they were ultimately crushed by the second and fourth American tech market forces: retail distribution and cloud streaming. They built the perfect interface. But they did not own the coaxial cables buried under the street. They did not own the satellite dishes on the roof. And they did not own the massive data centers that would eventually host the streaming revolution. They were forced to rely on partners like DirectTV and the cable monopolies, who eagerly used TiVo's brilliant software to teach their own customers how to time shift, only to ruthlessly replace the hardware with cheaper, generic boxes the moment the habit was secured. By the time the American public realized how much better the original TiVo interface was, the convenience of the bundled cable box, and the infinite frictionless library of the Internet cloud had already won. The hardware was rendered obsolete, not because the vision was wrong, but because the vision was so completely correct that the rest of the technology industry rushed in to absorb it. What vanished was not just a heavy metal box with a glowing green light. It was the era of physical ownership over the television feed. It was the brief, magical window of time when controlling the broadcast schedule meant physically upgrading a spinning hard drive on a living room floor, rather than simply paying a monthly subscription fee to a distant cloud server. Somewhere in America today, buried at the bottom of a cardboard box at a suburban estate sale, an original TiVo peanut remote still sits in the dark. The bright yellow pause button is faded from years of use. The device is silent. The interface is gone. The hard drive is dead. It waits for a glowing television screen and a live broadcast that no longer needs to be paused. See you in the next one.